Discussion we've been having with Tahoma for a long time now, but I'm going to ask him to do the welcome, and then let me speak briefly about our organisation and what we can offer.
Well, thank you, and good morning. Thank you and welcome all. I think this has been in the group for a long time, but really the main purpose or the idea was to have this gathering so that we can talk about the Somali Constitution. And I'm sure we're all aware about the Somali Constitution and the path it went through over the last 7-8 years. But really our focus here is to continue that discussion and also to lift up that discussion to a level where it will make sense to a lot more people. So through Melbourne Law School, I was talking to Professor Cheryl on this for a while, if you can get this opportunity, and at last I'm happy it happened. So really what we're trying to do today is, and I'm sure you have seen the PowerPoint presentation and so on, is to talk about those points. I don't want to cover them now because we'll be talking about them, but also at some stage we'll have our own local discussion among our Somali friends and talk about it a bit more. And then in the afternoon we will still continue and talk a bit more. So in essence, I guess the purpose is to talk about our constitution, but those specific 3 or 4 areas mentioned. And the outcome we expect is at the end to have some paper or communique or something that we can say, look, the summary of the discussions where it is, and share that with our folks back home and anyone else who wants it. So in summary, I think the goal is to lift up this discussion about the Somali Constitution. The people who are involved at the moment, we all know back home, but now it's the president of Hiroshima. So I told him this morning, this is what we're doing. And I want to show you the variation in education. What I really mean is, I didn't send him any notes, I didn't tell him anything about what we're doing. And he used one word that took me a long time to understand myself. At least now I'm beginning to understand, but it's in the presentation. He said, I'm a president of Hiroshima. And really what matters, Mohammed, for me is this concept of subsidiarity. He said, that's what I'm interested in. I just want to do my part of the job. I was so impressed. I said, don't worry, I know you. I know you very well as my friend. So I said, you know what? It's actually in the presentation, so that's one of the topics we're talking about. So I'm quoting him, and I'm hoping that if you can get it recorded, I'm going to send to you. So you have people of that caliber who can actually understand these concepts. And others, to be honest, that even the word constitution might be a challenge. so with that spectrum, we're trying to somehow narrow that gap and say, look, is there a room or an area where we can all come together and make sense out of this constitution? And if this constitution is supposed to help us, why is it becoming a problem itself? So hopefully through today's discussion and the discussion among ourselves, we might help that discussion and move it forward so that we can speed up this process and get to a situation where the constitution will be finalized and we can go to the referendum, and we have, just like any other country, some sort of constitution now. And without further ado, I will stop here, and I'm sure Soldiers will tell us about the days as we unfold of what we're going to achieve and so on. So I want to thank you again, and through you I want to thank the university for this opportunity. We're hoping to also have a follow-up after today, so subject to what we do today, and I thank you all, so please.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, it's going to impact on the way in which a federal system works, for example. So those are just a couple of complications that had occurred to me to add to our discussions about the nation, the nature of a constitution. And these points about who are the people and how can we engender a sense of a polity really complicated further by some of the other points you all made around the table about the lack of trust following from conflict and the general deterioration of institutions. And again, there are questions about how to start rebuilding that trust. So does anybody have any questions you want to raise about constitutions generally before we move on to the federalism stuff? Yeah.
How specific or how detailed should a constitution be? I remember an anecdote about President Reagan presented with a Maastricht EU constitution, and it was hundreds of pages, and while reading he fell asleep because the US constitution is about 18 pages, I understand, or less. So how extensive and how specific should a constitution be?
That is a very, very good question, to which there is no final answer. But let me just make a couple of points about that. So some of the older constitutions are pretty short. The American is one, but the Australian one, frankly, is pretty short as well. And there are some constitutional traditions that actually say a constitution, of course, is short. So the French tradition, I think, is for a short constitution. And a short constitution, in many ways, is quite a good idea, because if it's relatively short, then you can see what it's saying. Can sound pretty good and fairly stirring in parts. And to the extent that constitutions rest on people forcing their representatives to comply with them, then that's very important. Having said that, there is a tendency in the world at the moment to write very long constitutions. And if some of my constitution advising friends were here at the moment, they would be fainting as I extolled the virtues of short constitutions. And we've got to say to ourselves, what's going on here? And one of the answers is people are worried that constitutions are not fully owned by the communities in which they're supposed to operate, that the rule of law is not fully established, and therefore you've got to spell out every last detail so that nothing's left to the imagination, nothing's left to the operation of principle. And if you do have courts can sort of come down to subsection 54C and say, oh, that's what it says, so that's what you must do. Now, you can probably tell that I'm not hugely convinced by that. I think that there probably is some happy ground in the middle. But it is a real issue for you to think about. I mean, ideally, you would have a constitution that is comprehensible by people, that covers the main points. If there are particularly sensitive points, then it needs to cover them pretty carefully. But a constitution to which there is a commitment, and with courts that will sort of develop an approach to interpretation that gives effect to the spirit of the Constitution. I mean, that's the ideal. None of us have the ideal, I might say, including Australia. But I think that's a way of thinking about constitutions. Does that help?
Yes, maybe a follow-up thought. And what bothers me is exactly, here is the Somali Constitution, is how many pages?
It's not too long.
52 pages, 15 more. And there is, many people have raised the issue that the Somali people should be included in the making of the constitution. They should be informed.
It's the classic problem at the moment. Constitution making processes need to be open enough and potentially inclusive enough to give the Constitution this special status that it depends on. On the other hand, ordinary people don't have time, knowledge, interest to peruse constitutions in that way. I mean, one of the reasons why these processes can work in some places is that people trust their representatives to at least some degree, and that's important as well. At the very least, you need buy-in at the higher echelons across the country and a level of trust in them on the part of the ordinary people. Charmaine?
So just to follow up, that's what I was hearing from a lot of you, and that seemed to be the problem of writing things down.
Yeah.
As you would probably know, Mohammed, your dad almost pulled out from this because after they believed they'd written things down, built trust, agreed certain things, there was an argument from Puntland that words had been changed and trust was broken again. And then you had a court system where I think I understand at the time right after they were trying to reform the judiciary, so you didn't have trust in them either to interpret this. And in a lot of other places, all of those different points of trust would come together to build something, but you have that challenge of, as you, so many of you just said, still trying to build trust while doing this. My experience is interesting when you talk about even our constitution. We don't have most of how our country operates written into our constitution because we accepted conventions and then trusted our institutions. But one of the places I lived longest was Fiji, and it was so interesting because they adopted our similar Westminster conventions, when they came to writing a new constitution, they had to decide, do we just assume everyone knows them and can continue as conventions, or should we write them down?
I must say, I look at the current Somali constitution and I can tell who the
Yeah,
internationals
right,
were who were passing through.
Good question. Obviously, Somalia is moving from a unitary or central system to a federal system, and it's caused by the civil war. And population itself are divided even here from adamant federalists to people who still believe in the central system.
We will come to federalism in just a moment. Yes, there are. And there are also systems between federalism on the one hand and completely unitary centralised systems on the other. So Italy, Spain, South Africa, I mean all of these countries in a sense have made that sort of transition. And it's a challenging transition, but it's not impossible. And in the world that we live in at the moment, decentralisation to some degree is extremely fashionable because people are reacting against the purely centralised power. But we should come back to that because it's a very important point of how you actually do that. Can I just bring in my colleague Tom? Tom, did you want to...
Yeah, I just wanted to chip in regarding Ahmed's question about the length and detail constitutions, and I think this is where comparative knowledge can be really useful, because the Brazilian context, for example, you have a constitution adopted in 1988 after a dictatorship trying to establish a democratic system. It had 250 articles because you had 8 drafting committees, 20,000 submissions, no trust between the big political groups, and so they tried to put everything into the constitution. It's basically legislation for whole lengths of it. Because they were trying to just get it out of the political arena and make it absolute. But what you ended up with actually was a constitution where enormous energy for the last few decades has been just in constantly reforming the constitution. So, clear drafting and shorter can be better. But on that point, once again, I'm from a country that has a short constitution. It's from 1937, when constitutions were much shorter. But that doesn't stop you having the public having certain misconceptions or misunderstandings about the document. And I think that's where civic education comes in. And that need not necessarily involve massive state capacity, because that's an issue in Somalia, of course. But what you have to think about then is what Hoda was talking about in terms of the demographics of Somalia, tons of people under 40, and what Hamid was saying about mobile technology. There are ways and means of getting that information across in ways that sort of really target the people who need to get it.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. Yeah.
I think one of the hindrances that we have, or one of the problems that we have, is the central government never helped the people to understand what this constitution is all about. They never explained their rights. They never explained the the rights of the individual in the street.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting point, and it sort of links with what Tom was saying about civic education. And we could, at some stage, talk a little bit about how they manage this in South Africa. I know South Africa is sort of the poster child for public participation, but it really did do a good job. And when the Constitution was finally brought into effect, they produced, I don't have a copy anymore, but they produced a little booklet, a cartoon-style booklet for everybody, just dealing with the Bill of Rights, just sort of depicting the Bill of Rights and how it worked in sort of cartoon-style form. And it was just a wonderful way of sort of getting the message out of the Constitution, and the Constitution was actually for you as much as for the sort of the big heads with all the money. So those sorts of techniques could be explored and see how they fit in the Somali context at some stage. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, it's just short. The concept of constitution, as you explained, Professor Shadow, you mentioned about you compare the constitution in Australia to its own people. You said not many people know about the constitution. Constitution, to my understanding, is a system that country in one location, as you mentioned, use as a Bible or legislation to follow. But the trust is missing. So if the trust comes, anything like, even if it's 18 pages or 100 pages, can be solved. So the trust has to come first, and then I think everything else will follow. So.
Yeah, I just want to follow up from where Ahmed left. The Somali issues are far more deeper than the constitution. Since it has gone through 27 years of civil wars, 3 million people displaced, around 500,000 people have died as a result of the conflict. So what it is Somalia now is to go through a transitional justice process. It has to have a trust to Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which goes around the country, listens the people, goes around the refugee camps, listens the grievance of the people, and finds out how to address all those grievances. That's very important, and from there we can build on the trust. So if the constitution needs to be approved, how will you reach out to those people who are living under Shabab? That's one question. The other issue that stands is the issue of Somaliland. Somaliland have declared its secession in 1991, and it still sees itself separate from other Somalia. So if the constitution needs to apply all Somalia, how will you address the Somaliland issue? It's also another sticking point. And my final point is the Somali capital is Banadar, which is in Mogadishu. It's still an issue. It's not represented in both houses of parliament. They don't have any representation in the lower house, and they don't have any representation in the upper house. So whenever there's an issue about taxation, the current federal government only controls Mogadishu, which is the capital. And it draws its resource from the seaport and the airport. And there's a discourse among the Somali people living in Mogadishu. Why am I paying taxi if I am not represented? If I am not represented at the parliament? So that's also another issue. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with your point about constitutions can't solve all this. The only question, sooner or later, it will frame what's going on in Somalia, and the only question is whether and how it can be useful, I think.
This is like Boston Tea Party. It's no taxation without representation. but just very quickly, I just want to make a kind of point of order, maybe. I'm sorry, but the issue is we only have today, and half of the day is already gone. I'm just wondering, when I go to Nairobi and I meet these UN guys, they always tell me Somali's problem is an elephant. And I said, why is it an elephant? It's a big problem. And they keep on telling me all the time. And then one day an Indian guy, a friend of mine, gave me a good advice. He said, in India, they say, how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. So when I went back, I told them, I said, yes, Somali's problem will always be an elephant unless we start eating one piece at a time. So today, perhaps if you can only focus on those 4.
The question is which piece you start with. Do you start with the toenails or the trunk?
So yeah, we know all the problems, but let's really just focus on the constitution side of it. Yeah.
Just one quick question, Professor Saunders. What are the common pitfalls of people asking too much from the Constitution, focusing less on the processes?
Well, the common pitfall is that you don't comply with it. And that it might happen in a number of different ways. I mean, Tom referred to one a moment ago. You know, you put in too much detail, turns out that detail doesn't quite work, doesn't seem that important, so let's just not bother with that bit.
What I meant was not so much the Constitution itself, but it becoming so central to the political discourse, as opposed to focusing on. Well,
I think we do need a reality check on that. There's a lot of talk these days about how constitutions are being required to do more than they used to do, to build communities, to build nations, to overcome conflict and so on. And it's true that constitutions are being made in that context, and if they're being made in that context, then that's an important part of the context. But a constitution alone is just a bit of paper, as a number of you have already said. It needs to be supported by institutions and trust and a culture that's prepared to implement the Constitution. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
Because no one's talking about the fact that the courts don't work, but every politician is talking about the Constitution.
Yeah, well, you need to start getting the focus right back on institutions in that case and the way in which they operate. So we will move on. I think it's a message from my lips, but. I mean, I completely accept that we're here to talk about the Constitution, but these other points are essential to the way in which it actually works. And one of the points that Shamake's interventions made me think about is, is this going to ultimately be better off as a grassroots process up instead of a top-down process, or is there some sort of happy meeting ground? But that's something that only you guys
I would like to add one thing here. In relation to the capital is considered to be a city or a site that is the heart of Somalia. Mm-hmm. And there's an agreement, which is not yet implemented actually, that because it attracts almost everyone from all corners of Somalia, it should be addressed differently.
A couple of points about that, and then I'm going to move on to federalism. One, your idea that there are some parts of the country that everybody relates to, that binds people together, is very much part of the notion of federal design, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But secondly, the status and governance of the capital city is a big issue in lots of federations. I suspect it's a more complicated issue in Somalia because of the clan-based arrangements elsewhere in the country, making it difficult to work out how to have the mechanisms whereby everybody owns the city. But capital cities are quite often difficult to deal with in a federal context. Even in Australia, the residents of the ACT don't have the same sorts of rights as the people who live in the States because we didn't quite know how to fit the national capital into the federal scheme. So that's a big issue in Argentina with Buenos Aires, for example. So that it's an issue with particular complications in Somalia because of the rest of the system. And so what Do you draw from the United States experience about that?
I think, well, in relation to, I mean, I'm just mentioning what makes them to have a federal system, because initially they didn't have a federal system because they come all of them from British, and in Britain there's no federal system. The reason why they adopted the federal system is because of what had been in America at that time. There was a war in the north and the south, and all each state have its own power. But still, there is a system that we share, and that, you know, that will help us to work together as a nation.
For our example, though, and the reason probably today it's beneficial, what we can learn is United States, California, 6th economy in the world. But the head of California is quite happy to be called governor. But still in Somalia he says, no, I'm the president. So we have a circle.
A few days ago, I circulated the name. I say, look, personally, I don't believe adopting someone called president side. I think a premier is the most appropriate word for us, Somalis. Because it's hard to have 6 persons in the same room, all claiming to be president.
It does seem to be the least of all.
The federal system of Switzerland is called Eidgenossenschaft.
It's called
Eidgenossenschaft, which means cooperative and oath, and they enter into an oath. Genossenschaft or cooperative is an economic term. So probably the Swiss realized that it's in their economic interest, financial interest, to have, first of all, the cantons or the federation. My hope is that Somalis would realize that it is in their own economic survival and interest to have a federation that works and helps everybody.
I agree with you. Switzerland's a wonderful example.
Coming from a sort of an anthropological background, I would suggest that a sense of self-understanding and respecting how the structures we have now arrived, actually I think adds or enriches the conversation. For example, before the joke about presidents, the local governors call themselves presidents. Although that sounds ridiculous, and it does, but it speaks to the reality of, for example, local people having to be responsible for their security while they're pretending to be part of a government.
And it's important for at least 2 reasons. One, clearly that dynamic needs to be understood. But secondly, to the extent that you can use existing institutions and structures and allegiances and turn them to contemporary purposes, the easier it is. And it's one of the questions that I've often had with sort of constitution building in places where there's no developed sense of the state. How can you draw on existing communities to really sort of develop whatever you're seeking to develop? It's not been very well done anywhere, but I think it's a very important point that you raise. And any solutions you have would be most welcome.
Actually 2 comments. One, I love learning from Cheryl when I see stuff like this, because I didn't know that there were only 25 federations, which makes me think I should probably have done more homework before I went to Somalia all these times, because I didn't have to learn 195, I had to learn 25. And unfortunately for Somalia, you got Germany, because Max Planck went there, you got America, because the UN took an American there, and you got South Africa, because a South African went there. That actually we can learn. So Cheryl is so useful because she's a comparative constitutional person who won't say to you, I'm Australian, learn Australia, but can say, look, in India they tried this to solve this problem, in Switzerland they tried this, and in America they tried this. That idea that if you can articulate the problem, then we can look at comparative responses for multiple options about how to solve it.
And there are a lot of social structures also that are untranslatable in English. that get left behind or ignored, although they govern and have power and exercise power.
And both directions.
I think the understanding is that within Somali, from experience, if you put into the spotlight an issue, if you put absolutely that, for example, if you circulate a referendum, and you say this is the rule that you're going to be governed, what do you want to input to it? If you just put in lines and say, look, this is how you're going to be governed in this state through the federal. This is the federal framework. If you don't put your input into it now, it's going to be too late once it's decided. Probably that kind of things, a framework that basically circulates around the states and given sort of basic, some sort of a referendum that be given a time to say, like, for example, 4 months, 3 months or something, and goes to every state, every town. Here is how you're going to be governed in the federal. And if you don't want to have an input to it right now, then it's going to go and it's going to be voted and it's going to be signed off and it's going to become a law. Probably that will make, because if I know where I came from, deep south of Somalia, we only rely what the government says. We only rely what the elite government say, and we hope that it's good for everybody. Unless that is changed into some way of like Somali language writing. When the Somali language was written, there were people being sent to every town, every state, everywhere. So people can learn how to read and write the Somali language. Unless the very basic of what is a federalism, what is governance, what is the basic rules, that these very basic things that Professor is now talking about, have been written in Somali, made in a very, very bold way, given spaces for people can write their comments, and being distributed to smaller towns and everything. People don't feel the ownership, just don't feel ownership. They think that something that they hear from military, something they hear from governance, and something they hear from the man with the big head.
This is the overview of the issues that I want us to think about a little bit in relation to power in a federal system. Which powers go to each level of government? That's sort of the basic question. What's the framework for that? And I'll explain what that means when we get there, but it's not so simple as saying, you get this and I get that. You need to put it within a constitutional setting. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples just to get you thinking about how this really works, because clearly you need to adapt these ideas to the situation of Somalia. I want to touch very briefly on the question of dividing executive power in federal systems. It can be a complicated question, but I just want to seed it at least in your heads so that we can pick it up again if necessary. And then we've still got a little bit of time. Let's just have some discussion about those things, and then at 3 o'clock we'll pick up the tax powers and resources issues. So, the principles for how do you decide who gets what in a federal system? How do you decide which sorts of powers go to the central level and which go to the states? There are very different approaches to this in the federal systems of the world, but there are a few principles that you can identify which everybody talks about, even if they then apply them differently in their own circumstances. So the first principle that people talk about a lot these days is the principle of subsidiarity. Again, fancy word, heaven only knows how it translates into Somali. But basically it means that the powers should be assigned to the lowest level of government at which it can be exercised effectively. Now, some things can't be done effectively at a state or local level. Rivers run through whole countries. Interstate trade, by definition, runs across borders. There are certain things that can't be handled at a state level. But the principle of subsidiarity says it be the governing principle. If it can be done at the state level, why not do it there? Because the state is able to be more responsive to its people, assume that the states are functioning properly. And that's the question that I raised with you this morning, and that we were talking about a bit. How do you build a working polity that works in the public interest at the state level? That's the quid pro quo, really, for the principle of subsidiarity. So let's just assume that that's a sort of a general rule of thumb, this notion of subsidiarity. Then these sorts of factors are often said to influence the assignment of powers to the centre. So there are certain powers that are always thought of as being national. One of those we talked about this morning, the power to deal with external affairs. And that someone made the point in that context, but surely now that external affairs is so complicated and so multifaceted, maybe we need to unpack what we mean by that. And that may well be right, and I think that's an interesting thing to think about. But usually, for example, we would say that the authority to sign treaties with other countries is an authority assigned to the central level of government, whether or not that is exercised in consultation with the other governments in the Federation. The second factor that influences the assignment of things to the centre is cross-border effects. If things run across borders regularly, then maybe that's an indication that that needs to be handled centrally. And a third factor that influences the assignment of powers to the centre is if you make a decision that something needs to be uniform, that a law needs to be uniform. Of course you can get uniformity of law by getting 6 states together and saying, let's all pass the same law. And that actually does happen quite a lot in Australia. But there are some things you just know you need to have the same law. Weights and measures. There's no point having different weights and measures across the country. Why wouldn't you just have one central legislature passing that law? Probably also true of copyright. I mean, some of these matters are now so international in their character that they're effectively, there are international norms for copyright law that people tend to pick up. So in the Somali context, you need to give some thought to what you think should be uniform and what you don't care about so much. And again, as I say, different people have different answers to that. For example, when the Australian Constitution was being put together, the framers had a big argument about whether marriage law should be uniform across the country or not. Some federations say yes, some federations say no. The Australians said, well, we should be able to have uniform marriage law. So they made it a federal power. But until it was exercised, it was a state power. So for 60 years, the Australian states ran the marriage law in Australia. And no doubt there were differences between that law. And then finally, in 1961, the federal parliament got around to passing a Marriage Act. Factors influencing the assignment of power to the states are really the opposite of many of these central criteria, and so they're not particularly surprising. Can a power effectively be exercised within the state? Town planning is an obvious example. Planning the city of Melbourne seems to me to be nobody's business except the business of the people of Victoria. Clearly that's something that can be done within the state. Should the exercise of power be responsive to local needs? Housing, aspects of social security, very often education is thought to be the sort of function that should be responsive to local communities, even if there's some level of uniformity of standards across the country. Does the power relate mainly to local conditions, questions of culture, local transport? Many environmental matters are purely local. You know, whether there's pollution in the bay here is a local matter. Whether the greenhouse gases are getting out of control is an international matter. And this last dot point that I added here is, I've added it for you, really, because it does seem to me that when there has been a status quo, it may be difficult to disturb unless there's a good reason to disturb it. So given the discussions that we had about Puntland, so for example, you can give powers to one or other of the levels of government in a way that they're exclusive or concurrent. Exclusive, only that level of government can exercise the power. The other one has no say. The power to impose customs duties, taxes on goods passing over state borders, taxes on goods passing over borders, isn't exclusive in that area at all. Or alternatively, you can confer some powers in a way that's concurrent. Now, what that means is that both levels of government can exercise the power. Then, of course, with the problem of them both exercising the power in a way that clashes or is inconsistent. But in the absence of inconsistency, concurrency can be quite useful. It might mean that the federal government doesn't use the whole of the power, in which case the states can exercise part of the power. Or it might mean, as in my example of marriage law in Australia, the federal government doesn't exercise the power at all for years, decades. And so the states have the opportunity to exercise the power during that time.
Why do you do it, Gerald?
Partly because it's much more flexible. I mean, take the power over interstate trade, for example. Whoever exercises the whole of the power over interstate trade? If you said it was an exclusive federal power, then nothing that a state did that had anything to do with interstate trade would ever be valid. I mean, it's sort of madness. So it can be flexible, but it does mean that you need a rule for resolving conflict. The rule usually is that the federal level, the federal law prevails over the state law, although there are some examples that I won't bore you with where the reverse is true. So you can do whatever you like, but the usual rule is that the federal law prevails. So if you're interested in concurrent powers as a mechanism, one extra thing that you need to think about in relation to a division of powers is which, if any, of the powers should be assigned exclusively, either to the centre or to the states, and which powers should be conferred concurrently. The second dot point, some federations have experimented with the idea of what they call framework powers. And the idea here, it's quite a good idea in principle, just doesn't work very well in practice. The idea here is that the central parliament passes a framework. This is the framework for dealing with environmental pollution. This is the framework for dealing with universities, but leaves the important details to be legislated by the states within that framework. The danger with that way of dividing powers is that people have different ideas about what amounts to framework laws. So, I'm a federal parliament with, and I'm used to exercising power, and so I fill in a lot of the details in my framework law, and then you have an argument about whether it's really a framework law or not. But it is a technique that you can think about in some cases. Third point, however you decide to allocate power between levels of government, I think you need to have it in the Constitution. and we talked about that a little bit before the break. Some countries do it the way Australia does, just have a section 51 of the Australian Constitution. You can look at it for yourselves at some stage, which just lists 40 powers for the federal government. Some do it like India, where you add schedules to the Constitution. So you have the first schedule lists all the exclusive central powers, the second schedule lists all the exclusive state powers, the third schedule lists all the concurrent powers. And many recent federations do that list approach. Those lists tend to be very detailed. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that they need to be as detailed as they are, but nevertheless, the question of how much detail you put in them depends very much on the bargaining that goes on about which level of government gets which power. Fourth point, we've already dealt with to some extent. You need to have a rule to resolve inconsistency between laws exercising the respective powers, particularly if the powers are concurrent. The fifth point, whatever you do and however detailed your constitution, there will always be some powers you didn't think of. There will never be an exhaustive list of everything that governments might ever want to do in a federal constitution. So you need to make some sort of decision about who gets the unlisted powers. And the jargon that federal scholars use is who gets the residual power. Does it go to the centre? Does it go to the states? Again, very different practice across the federations of the world. And that is really the last point made there. All of these matters, those 25 plus federal systems that we talked about before the break, make very different choices. Now, just by way of an example of how these ideas are mixed in different federal systems, let me just take you to India and Australia. Not because they're models, just because they're examples of how you mix some of these different ideas. So in India, you do have those lists at the end of the constitution, a very long exclusive list for the centre, a not quite so long exclusive list for the states, and a quite long concurrent list quite long concurrent list. In India, the residual power, any unlisted power, goes to the centre. And in India, there is a rule that a law passed by the centre, if it's valid, will be supreme over state law unless the state law had been reserved for the assent of the president being the figurehead at the centre in India. So there's an interesting attempt to try and have your cake and eat it too under the Indian constitution. So that's one little model, and been quite influential. I think the Nepalese constitution drew quite heavily on the Indian model. I think the Malaysian constitution drew quite heavily on the Indian model. But then think about Australia, completely different. Very little exclusive power at all under the Australian constitution. One quite long list of concurrent powers for the centre, which is in section 51. A rule that Commonwealth laws prevail over state laws, and then all unlisted powers go to the states. So they're both using exactly the same federal building blocks that I outlined in the earlier slide, but using them in completely different ways, and in ways that work perfectly, more or less satisfactorily at least, in the context of those two countries. Okay, so here's an example, but it's very sort of topical and a bit offbeat. The Commonwealth has a marriage power. You know there's been a debate in this country about what marriage is. Is marriage between a man and a woman, or can it also be between two people of the same sex? For a while, the Commonwealth position was marriage is only between a man and a woman. Okay, said the states. In that case, marriage between two peoples of the same sex is a residual power. You don't have it because it doesn't fall within the federal marriage power. Therefore, we have it. And we'll exercise it. And that's exactly what the Australian Capital Territory did. And then that brought on a High Court case where the High Court said, actually, the federal marriage power is a broader power than that. It's not a residual power at all. So that's an example. But you can find plenty of examples. You know, the federal parliament has a power over interstate trade, interstate and overseas trade. Does the conduct of abattoirs for meat that might eventually go into overseas trade fall within federal power? If it doesn't, it's a residual power and it's a state power, and the states can do what they like with their abattoirs. Sooner or later, that sort of issue gets thrashed out, either through negotiation between the levels of government or judicial interpretation.
And also public holidays and Australia Day. It's a lot of confusion.
Perfect example. Public holidays, not in, and so it's a residual power. And the fact that at least some public holidays fall on the same day, including Australia Day, is really the result of intergovernmental cooperation. But you can see how that works. I mean, what was it? Last year, the year before, the Premier said we're going to have a holiday for the grand final. It's purely an example of residual power.
If you are dealing with, let's say, contagious disease, for example, that will spread all over the country, so you would think that the federal government should take responsibility for dealing with that, containing that. But if you are dealing with primary health care, let's say at the local level, then this should be left to the states. So you can't say health health belongs to the states or let's say to the federal government. So is these lists, for example, of India or Australia, are they so detailed, separated, and a list of maybe 15 items covering health, or it just talks about health?
The Indian one is quite detailed. I'm not quite sure what it says about health, but it tends to be a very detailed list. The Australian one is not particularly detailed at all, and in fact, it leaves all health to the states as a residual power. The federal government has got in on the Act, partly because it has a power over insurance, and that means health insurance. And so that gives it a very substantial interest in hospitals and health. And it gets some other interest in the fact that it gives so many grants for health purposes. But in fact, I mean, you're right, of course, that rapidly spreading contagious disease may need national action. And you might be able to get at that in a different way with the way in which you describe powers, through some sort of national emergency or pan-endemic power or something like that. And Australia is not a country that's threatened by, rapidly spreading contagious diseases anyway. But, interesting, many of the sort of health concerns have been dealt with just by this quite simple division of powers, partly with the federal government controlling entry into Australia and therefore controlling disease coming in, which is easy for an island and hard for Somalia.
We were talking about federal and state. That's where I'm heading. So they have to get together and put the list in different shelves, or?
No, when you were drawing up a final constitution, so we were talking about that a bit before, the way the present provisional constitution leaves it to the two levels of government to sort it out. That's very unusual in a federal context. You would normally expect to find these matters settled in the Constitution. And sure, they may later be subject to amendment, they may be subject to interpretation. You might build in flexibility. For example, the Australian Constitution has a provision that says the states may refer their power to the central parliament if they think that's a good thing to do. There's all sorts of ways of dealing with this. But somebody at some stage, as a matter of constitutional design, needs to sit down and say, what do we want each of these levels of government to do, and within what framework do we want them to do it? Now, I know that's a difficult task, but that's the reason for opening it up here. And you can get some sort of thoughts going just by looking at what some other countries do, just to see the sorts of powers that they cover. But at the end of the day, you're going to want to do things that suit the situation in Somalia.
It's very easy to understand, the way you explain it. But if you just transfer this set of four to Somalian context, what do you think where to start and how to start?
Well, it comes back to that discussion we had about the people before lunch. To what extent I think the idea that somebody came up with before lunch about trying to put these ideas in a form that A, can be understood in local languages, and B, the ideas can be grasped, I think is a good idea. But I actually think that people with some understanding about how government works, like yourselves, should sort of sit down and say, realistically, knowing what we know about Somalia, how do we think this should work?
I think in the case of Somalia, it's very lucky because most of the fundings, money is paid by non-Somalis. So, for example, if there's a health issue in, say, somewhere in Somalia, there's a drought or farming or maybe a war, always the funding is paid by third group, European, American, Arabs, and so on. So and that's a problem because they're lacking the responsibility to address the issues in question, and let alone making a law for that. But even think about it.
It's interesting. There's a bit of an interest in at least some places in the world in trying to manage that sort of problem in the Constitution, at least to the point of talking about what procedures you should have for the receipt of that sort of foreign assistance, and terms on which conditions should be accepted, those sorts of issues. It's maybe something that you could do without at this point, but it does sound like it's a real issue to be managed. So the federal ones, foreign affairs, defence, monetary policy, central bank, citizenship, transportation, post and telegraphs, law of the sea, organised crime, counter-piracy, economic development, health, education, research, technology, blah, blah, blah.
No, keep going, natural resources.
Yeah.
Everything.
The states first and foremost have to pass some of the money that they collected as a tax to the federal government. The federal government can later on pay the cost of health or maybe roads or whatever. But as long as they are not getting anything by themselves, and all the states are managing their money, then you will heavily rely in the years to come to others to come and pay that cost.
I mentioned to you earlier that legislative power, we need to think about how you divide executive power. Now, let's not be too complicated about the idea of executive power. Let's just assume for the moment that executive power is the idea of developing policy and putting legislation into action. So I'm a parliament and I pass a health law, and then I'm the Department of Health and I put the health law into effect. I'm the parliament and I pass an education law setting up secondary education, and then I have a vast bureaucracy administering education. So let's just think about executive power in that way. Now, there are two main ways of dealing with this in a federal system. One is to say, whichever level of government has the legislative power to pass laws also has the executive power to put those laws into effect. So if you give not a good example, if you give foreign affairs to the central level of government, it has executive power over foreign affairs. If you give education to the central level of government, it has executive power over education. So that's one way of doing it. That's the way Australia does it. That's the way the United States does it. It's the way Canada does it. Another way of doing it is to say, well, sometimes executive power follows legislative power, but more often than not, the centre might have legislative power, but the states implement the legislation. They have executive power. So that's, I'll be with you just a second. That's a different way of dividing executive power. So, and it's a way of trying to make sure that legislation is administered in a way that's closer to the people. So this is and sometimes countries like India, for example, use the idea of concurrent power in that way. They say, well, if the centre has exclusive power to make laws, it also has executive power to execute those laws. But if it only has concurrent power to make laws, then the states will implement those laws unless we say something different in our legislation. So that's just another way of, I know this is confusing and complicated, but it's just another way of dealing with this. You can perhaps give the central level quite significant legislative power, but say a lot of that legislation is going to be administered by the states, exercising their constitutional authority to administer that legislation. Now, this is originally a German invention. I actually think it's very clever in the German context, but you've got to have a lot of trust between the levels of government, as you can imagine, to make this work. But it is a different way of dividing powers, a way that enables you to centralise a lot of legislative power, but to decentralise the application of that legislation on the ground. So I mentioned...
But in that situation, it will take a lot of time to debate, and when you put together, those two sets.
Look, it's any sort of option in Somalia, and if it's not, then put it out of your heads. There's no doubt that sort of keeping the two things together is simpler. But I just wanted to mention it to you simply because some of the more recent federations, South Africa does the same, India does it, Malaysia I think has a similar sort of mechanism. So you might come across it, whether you want to do it yourself or not. In discussions you might come across it, and you should be aware that that is another way of dealing with these things. And it doesn't have to be a general rule. I mean, if for some reason, take your health example, if for some reason you said, no, contagious diseases and nationwide health problems are just too likely in Somalia, health has got to be a national legislative power. But you might in those circumstances say, but the actual delivery of health services will be done by states. There's no, you could do that. Just pick out one or two powers to be treated in that way. I mean, it's endless flexibility in the way in which you put
I
things.
think that's the best way. I think that's the best way. Just to say it's the best format. Let them, the central government should come up with the law, but pass that to the state run in their way, because they know they are there.
Okay, well, I think you should just think about that as a group, and we can give you some more examples and introduce you to people who have done those sorts of things.
Just one quick question, Professor. I think we learned a lot. Thank you very much. And maybe I'm going ahead of myself, but we already drafted the Constitution of Somalia. We ratified it. There is a situation in the West where a particular point of the Constitution was disputed, and the two parties were consulted constitutional experts before they go to court. Generally, constitutions are so complicated that even the constitutional lawyers would interpret differently.
Because maybe the politicians dispute, but as soon as the lawyers look at it, they say, nah, it's obvious what the answer to that. It's very unlikely you'd win that. And so it goes away. So only the most difficult questions are likely to get to a court. Things that you just haven't thought about before. And then sure, you can have lawyers having different answers. But there's not squillions of these cases. I mean, in Australia, there have been some very significant cases over the years, but then a point of uncertainty is settled and you just move on. But governments use constitutions as creatively as they can, particularly when it's a matter of getting more power.